Two Apache sought shelter. One found the woman he never knew he needed. The wind had started early that afternoon, whipping across the dry desert plains with a strength that made it difficult to even walk in a straight line. Dust and sand stung their eyes, forcing two Apache men, Tay and Jeline, to squint against the sky that had darkened far too quickly. Clouds, heavy and swollen, rolled across the horizon, blotting out the sun and turning the landscape into a strange, shadowed world. The men had been traveling for days, moving through the desert in search of work, in search of something to hold onto, though neither of them fully understood what that something was. Tay was tall, with broad shoulders that seemed almost carved from the same earth he walked on. His hair, long and dark, hung in damp strands from his head, and his eyes, sharp and thoughtful, scanned the horizon constantly, anticipating the sudden shifts that could come in this harsh land. Jeline, on the other hand, was quieter, smaller in stature, but his presence was steady and reassuring, like the slow, unyielding flow of a river. Both carried the weight of history on their shoulders, not just the history of their people, but the personal histories that left deep scars. As the first drops of rain began to fall, sharp and cold against their skin, Tay tugged at his worn jacket, feeling the chill sink into his bones. The storm, though not unexpected in these parts, always seemed to arrive with a force that reminded travelers how small and fragile they were. Jeline, carrying a bundle of supplies over his shoulder, glanced at Tay and gave a small, knowing nod. No words were needed. They both understood the urgency. They needed shelter, and they needed it soon. The wind intensified and the rain became heavier, pounding the ground in a relentless rhythm that made the dusty paths into slick, treacherous mud. The men stumbled forward, their boots sinking slightly into the soft earth with each step. In the distance, the outline of a small cabin emerged, half hidden behind a cluster of rocks and a few gnarled trees. Its roof sagged and the wood looked weathered and gray, but to Tay and Jeline it was a beacon, a promise of safety and warmth. As they approached, Tay felt a flicker of relief. "We might get through this night without being drenched to the bone," he said, his voice low but filled with a quiet hope. Jeline didn't reply immediately, his eyes studying the cabin with caution. They had learned long ago not to trust appearances. Many times, abandoned places promised safety only to hide hidden dangers. Yet something about this cabin felt different. Perhaps it was the way the storm seemed to part around it, or perhaps it was simply the hope that desperation provides. Once inside, they shook off the rain and mud as best they could. The interior was dim and musty, with the scent of old wood and damp earth filling the space. A fireplace stood against one wall, cold and empty, and the floors creaked under their weight. Small windows allowed streaks of gray light to filter in, casting shadows that danced in the corners. It was not luxurious, nor even particularly comfortable, but it was dry, and for that, Tay and Jeline were grateful. They set down their belongings and began making the place livable for the night. Jeline gathered small pieces of wood he found scattered across the floor, stacking them neatly in the fireplace. Tay searched for dry spots to sit and make themselves more comfortable. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling and rain slapping against the walls, but inside there was a sense of calm. For the first time that day, they could breathe without fear of being swept away by the storm. As they worked, the two men began to talk, their voices low against the backdrop of the storm. Jeline spoke of his family, who still lived on the outskirts of a nearby town. He had left to find work, to send back money, to create opportunities that the desert could never provide. Tay listened intently, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking quiet questions. Then Tay spoke, sharing stories of his own childhood, the lessons his father had taught him, and the losses he had endured. Each story revealed layers of their character, the depth of their experiences, and the quiet strength they carried. The storm outside seemed to make time slow down. Each drop of rain, each gust of wind, added weight to their stories, to the connection forming between the two men. They laughed quietly at small memories, shared moments of reflection, and for a while the harshness of the world outside faded into the background. Inside that small cabin, they felt the fragile warmth of human companionship, a warmth that had been missing from both their lives for too long. Then, as evening fell, a new sound pierced the rhythm of the storm. A knock at the door, tentative and careful, echoed through the cabin. Tay and Jeline froze, exchanging a glance that held unspoken questions. Who could be out there in this weather? They approached the door slowly, the tension rising with each step. When Tay opened it, there stood Mara, a woman soaked from head to toe, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide but calm. "Please, may I come in?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying through the storm. There was a strength in her presence, a quiet determination that immediately drew Tay's attention. Without hesitation, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Jeline offered a blanket, which Mara accepted gratefully, wrapping it around herself as if it were a shield against both the storm and the exhaustion she carried. Once inside, Mara shared her own story. She had been traveling to a neighboring town when the storm forced her to seek shelter. Her words were measured, but there was a vulnerability beneath them, a sense of someone who had faced hardships yet remained resilient. Tay listened, intrigued by the way she spoke, by the honesty in her tone, and by the subtle strength that radiated from her even in her soaked and shivering state. The three settled near the fire, though it remained unlit, and shared what little food and water they had. Conversation flowed naturally, weaving together tales of survival, memories of home, and dreams for the future. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, a fragile sense of community emerged. Each person, in their own way, found comfort in the presence of the others. As night fell and the storm reached its peak, Tay found himself watching Mara quietly, noticing the small gestures she made, the way she brushed wet strands of hair from her face, the way her eyes lit up at small jokes, the way she listened intently when others spoke. He felt something stir inside him, a feeling he couldn't quite name but recognized as important. For the first time in a long while, he realized that life could still bring unexpected moments of connection, even amidst chaos. Jeline, sensing the bond forming between Tay and Mara, chose to remain quietly supportive, focusing on practical matters like keeping the cabin warm and ensuring everyone had a safe place to rest. He understood that some things could not be forced but had to develop naturally. He watched as the firelight danced across Tay's face, reflecting curiosity, care, and an emerging sense of responsibility, not just for survival, but for the emotional safety of those around him. Hours passed in quiet conversation, punctuated by the occasional crash of thunder or the relentless drumming of rain. They shared stories that revealed their pasts without revealing too much, leaving space for the other's imagination to fill. In these moments, Tay and Mara found themselves drawn to each other, not through grand gestures, but through shared experiences, laughter, and understanding. It was subtle yet powerful, like a slow-growing flame that promised warmth even in the coldest of storms. By the time the storm began to show signs of slowing, a sense of calm had settled over the cabin. Outside, the rain had lessened, the wind softened, and the world beyond seemed quieter, almost reverent after the night's fury. Inside, the three of them sat in companionable silence, each lost in thought, yet connected through the shared ordeal. Tay realized that in the middle of an unpredictable storm, he had found something far more valuable than shelter. He had found the beginnings of human connection, trust, and perhaps even hope. It was a night that none of them would forget. The storm had brought them together, forced them into proximity, and stripped away the distractions of daily life. In the harsh, unyielding desert, they had found shelter, not just from the rain, but from loneliness, fear, and uncertainty. For Tay, the night marked the first stirrings of a feeling he had not anticipated. The recognition that sometimes, the people we are meant to meet arrive when we least expect them, and their presence changes everything. As they finally settled down to rest, Tay looked at Mara and then at Jeline, feeling a sense of gratitude he could not put into words. The storm would pass, the world outside would return to its usual rhythm, and they would all face their separate challenges. But the memory of this night, the connection forged in shared vulnerability, would stay with him forever. A reminder that even in the harshest conditions, the human heart could find warmth, understanding, and perhaps even the beginnings of love. The storm had finally passed, leaving the desert quiet and still. The air smelled fresh, clean, and slightly earthy, carrying the faint scent of wet soil and distant flowers that had survived the rain. Sunlight broke through the clouds in soft beams, casting golden streaks across the landscape. Tay, Jeline, and Mara emerged from the cabin cautiously, their clothes still damp, their hair sticking to their faces, but their spirits lifted by the calm after the chaos. For Tay, the first moments after the storm were almost magical. He watched the sunlight glint on the wet rocks, on the puddles forming in the desert's uneven terrain, and for a brief moment, the hardships of life seemed to fade away. Jeline, ever practical, began to gather sticks and brush to reinforce the cabin, ensuring it remained a safe shelter in case the storm returned. Mara helped him, and Tay observed them both with a quiet sense of wonder. The two were completely different, yet they moved with a rhythm that felt natural, balanced, and somehow comforting. Over the next few days, the three stayed close to the cabin. With the roads washed out and the town still inaccessible, they had no choice but to rely on one another. Meals were simple: bread, dried meat, and water from a nearby stream. They cooked over a small fire, laughing at the challenges of keeping it lit in the damp air. Tay, who had usually been silent during such tasks, found himself speaking more freely than he had in years. He told stories of his childhood, of the deserts he had crossed, and the lessons his father had taught him about survival and respect for the land. Mara listened intently, her eyes bright with interest. She asked questions about his life, about the traditions he still held onto, and about the people he loved and had lost. In return, she shared her own story, one of struggle, of moving from place to place in search of opportunity, and of a longing for a life that felt both meaningful and safe. Tay noticed something remarkable. Mara had faced hardships too, yet she had a calm strength that he had rarely encountered in anyone. She spoke without complaint, without bitterness, and yet her words carried the weight of experience and wisdom. Jeline, sitting nearby, occasionally chimed in with his own observations or practical advice, but he mostly stayed in the background, allowing Tay and Mara to connect. He understood that some bonds needed space to grow. What he did not fully realize at first was how the connection between Tay and Mara was deepening with each passing moment. Small gestures, small shared experiences, and the quiet intimacy of survival were creating an invisible thread between them, a thread neither had anticipated but both welcomed. One afternoon, after the sun had warmed the earth and dried most of their clothes, Tay and Mara walked toward the nearby stream to fetch fresh water. The path was narrow and lined with wildflowers and shrubs, and as they walked, they talked about simple things: the patterns of clouds, the way sunlight reflected on the water, and the songs of birds returning after the storm. There was laughter in their conversation, easy and unforced, and Tay felt a warmth in his chest he could not ignore. Mara's presence was calming yet invigorating, like finding shade on a sweltering day and then discovering a gentle breeze. "You seem happy here," Mara said suddenly, her voice soft. She tilted her head slightly, looking at him with curiosity. Tay hesitated, then smiled faintly. I don't know," he admitted. "I've been through a lot and I don't often feel at ease. But here with you and Jeline I feel different, Lighter somehow. Mara's eyes softened. "I feel the same way," she said quietly. "I didn't expect to find people like you in a place like this, but maybe that's how life works sometimes. The unexpected things are the ones that matter most." They carried water back to the cabin in silence, a comfortable silence filled with unspoken understanding. The small cabin, once just a shelter from the storm, had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where they could drop their guards and be themselves. Tay noticed the subtle ways Mara made the cabin feel like home, arranging small piles of wood neatly, sweeping the damp floor, even lighting the fire carefully so it would burn steadily through the night. She moved with purpose, with thoughtfulness, and Tay admired her for it. As the day went on, they shared more stories. Mara talked about her family, about a younger brother she missed terribly, and about the small joys she had found along the way despite hardships. Tay shared tales of hunting and traveling with his father, of the traditions that shaped him, and of lessons learned the hard way. The stories flowed naturally, sometimes interrupted by laughter, sometimes by quiet reflection. Every shared word, every glance, every small act of kindness strengthened the bond between them. At night, sitting by the fire as the desert cooled and shadows stretched long across the landscape, Tay found himself watching Mara more closely. There was a gentle intensity in the way she listened, a quiet curiosity in her eyes, and a warmth in her smile that seemed to light the cabin brighter than the fire ever could. Jeline had noticed too, but he said nothing. He only smiled faintly, seeing the change in his friend, understanding that something important was taking root in Tay's heart. The days passed slowly, yet each one felt full. Tay and Mara began to anticipate each other's presence, finding small joys in shared routines. Preparing meals together, collecting firewood, exploring the area near the cabin, and even sitting in companionable silence while the sun set over the desert. The simplicity of life, stripped of distractions and noise, allowed them to notice things they might have missed otherwise. The curve of Mara's smile when she laughed, the way Tay's eyes softened when he spoke of his past, and the quiet strength they each carried despite life's challenges. One evening, as the sky painted itself in shades of orange and pink, Mara and Tay sat together outside, watching the desert shift in the fading light. The wind was gentle now, carrying only the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird returning to its nest. Tay felt a strange combination of peace and longing, peace in the present moment, longing for something he couldn't yet name. "I never thought I'd feel like this," Tay admitted after a pause, his voice barely above a whisper. Mara looked at him, curiosity and understanding shining in her eyes. "Like what?" she asked softly. "Connected, like I've known someone forever, even though I just met you," he said. He didn't understand fully why he felt this way, only that it was undeniable. Mara reached out, lightly brushing a stray strand of hair from his forehead, and smiled. It was a small gesture, but it carried warmth, care, and an unspoken promise. Days turned into a rhythm. The three of them worked together, ate together, laughed together, and shared quiet moments under the desert sky. Tay began to realize that Mara was not just someone who had found shelter during a storm. She was someone who had entered his life in a way that felt meaningful, inevitable even. He found himself thinking about her when she wasn't near, feeling a strange emptiness when she stepped away, and a warmth whenever she smiled. Jeline, always observant, noticed the subtle shifts in Tay's behavior. The way he lingered a moment longer when talking to Mara, the way his laughter was a little lighter, and the way he seemed more at ease than he had in years. Jeline said nothing directly, understanding that some things needed to grow naturally, without interference. He simply continued to support both of them, ensuring the cabin was secure, the fire was strong, and the routines remained uninterrupted. One afternoon, Mara suggested exploring a small canyon not far from the cabin. Tay agreed eagerly, and together they walked, leaving Jeline behind to rest. The canyon was breathtaking, with cliffs that rose high above them, wildflowers clinging to the edges, and a small stream running through its center. As they walked, they talked about hopes, fears, and dreams. Mara admitted her longing for stability and for a place to call home. Tay, in turn, shared his desire for meaningful connection, for a life that went beyond mere survival. The walk ended at a small ledge overlooking the canyon. The sun glinted off the rocks, and the shadows stretched long and soft. Tay felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. In Mara's presence, he realized he wanted more than companionship. He wanted to protect her, support her, and be part of her life in ways he hadn't allowed himself to imagine before. Mara looked at him, sensing the shift, and a quiet understanding passed between them. As they returned to the cabin, the air felt charged with unspoken possibilities. Neither spoke immediately, yet both knew the bond they shared had grown deeper, stronger, and more personal. That night, as they sat near the fire with Jeline, the three shared another simple meal, but the connection between Tay and Mara was undeniable. It was no longer just about survival or shelter. It was about companionship, trust, and the beginnings of something that neither had expected but both welcomed fully. By the time the second week arrived, the storm had become a distant memory, but its effects remained. The cabin, once a temporary refuge, had become a place of comfort and routine. Tay and Mara's connection had grown from subtle glances and small gestures into shared smiles, laughter, and quiet conversations that lasted long into the night. The bond was no longer tentative. It was real, tangible, and powerful. In these simple, everyday moments, Tay realized that Mara was not just a companion he had met by chance. She was someone who had filled a space in his life he hadn't even known was empty. The realization was both startling and comforting. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, understanding that the storm had brought them together, but it was their choices, their shared experiences, and their willingness to open their hearts that had solidified the connection. By the time the storm had passed, and the desert returned to its usual rhythm, Tay, Jeline, and Mara were more than just companions. They had become a small family of sorts, bound together by circumstance and choice. Yet, as with any journey, the reality waiting outside the cabin began to pull at them. Supplies were running low, the roads were still rough and dangerous, and the responsibilities that each had left behind could no longer be ignored. The brief, magical isolation that had allowed their bond to grow was giving way to the practicalities of life, and each of them felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Tay woke early one morning, before the sun had fully risen, and stepped outside the cabin to watch the desert glow in soft shades of pink and gold. The night had been cool, and the morning air carried a sharp freshness that made him breathe deeply. He looked at Mara, who was still inside, moving quietly as she prepared their meager breakfast. She hummed softly, a tune that seemed to fit perfectly with the desert's calm, and for a moment Tay felt an almost painful sense of contentment. This moment, he realized, was precious. The storm had tested them, brought them together, and now, in the quiet after it, he understood how fragile yet powerful their connection had become. Jeline joined them soon after, carrying water from the nearby stream. He had been observing the weather and the terrain, calculating the safest route to reach the town where they had lined up work. "The roads will be passable soon," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to start thinking about moving on, finding our jobs, and taking care of our responsibilities." His words, practical as they were, cast a small shadow over the cabin's warmth. Tay and Mara exchanged glances, both understanding that change was coming. Over the next few days, they began preparing for the journey back to civilization. The cabin had become too small to remain in comfortably for much longer, and the supplies they had brought were nearly exhausted. Packing was slow, careful, and deliberate. Each of them took stock of what they needed to carry, not just for survival but for the lives they were about to re-enter. Tay felt a strange tension in his chest. The thought of leaving the desert, the cabin, and the intimacy of their shared experiences weighed heavily on him. Yet he knew that returning to the world outside was unavoidable. During one afternoon, as they gathered supplies near the cabin, Mara suddenly stopped and looked at Tay with a seriousness that made him pause. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. Her eyes searched his, full of honesty and something deeper that made his heart tighten. Tay nodded, encouraging her to continue. Mara shared more about her life than she had before. She spoke of a loss she had endured years earlier, of the fear she sometimes felt when moving from place to place, and of the longing she had for stability and belonging. Tay listened, moved not only by her words but by the trust she placed in him. In that moment, he realized how much she had opened herself up to him, and he felt an overwhelming desire to protect, support, and care for her. It was a realization both startling and comforting. The following evening, the three sat outside the cabin as the sun dipped low on the horizon. Shadows stretched across the desert, and the air carried a gentle coolness that made them huddle closer to the small fire they had kept alive. Jeline, sensing the growing intimacy between Tay and Mara, offered subtle gestures of support, handing them blankets, quietly gathering wood, and giving them moments alone without intruding. He understood that some connections could not be rushed, and that patience was sometimes the greatest gift one could give. Tay and Mara used these moments to deepen their bond. They spoke of hopes, fears, and dreams that they had not shared with anyone else. Mara admitted that she had never imagined finding someone who would understand her so completely, someone who could make her feel safe and valued without needing to change who she was. Tay, in return, confessed that he had never realized how much he had been missing, not just companionship, but the feeling of being truly seen and understood. As they talked, small gestures became as important as words. Tay would brush a strand of wet hair from Mara's face. Mara would gently adjust his jacket to protect him from the chill, and both of them would share smiles that spoke volumes about the bond forming between them. These moments, seemingly ordinary, carried extraordinary meaning. The desert, once harsh and unforgiving, had become a backdrop for the quiet growth of trust, care, and affection. However, the world beyond the cabin could not be ignored. One morning, Jeline returned from scouting the path to town with news that weighed heavily on all three. "The roads are passable, but it will be a difficult journey. Supplies are limited, and we must be careful," he warned. The reality of leaving the safety of the cabin brought a mixture of fear and anticipation. Tay felt a tension he could not shake, the knowledge that leaving meant stepping back into a world that demanded strength, courage, and resilience in different ways. Mara, too, felt the weight of returning to responsibilities she could not escape. Preparing to leave was both practical and emotional. They packed supplies with care, ensuring food, water, and essential items were ready for the journey. At the same time, Tay and Mara found themselves lingering on shared moments, reluctant to leave the intimacy they had created. Each glance, each touch, each small smile felt like a silent promise to carry the connection forward, no matter what challenges awaited. During their final evening at the cabin, they shared a meal that was simple yet comforting. The sun set in brilliant shades of orange and gold, casting a warm glow over the desert. Tay and Mara sat close, their hands occasionally brushing, and in that quiet closeness, unspoken feelings grew stronger. They did not need to rush, did not need to declare everything at once. The understanding between them was deep and real, a silent acknowledgement that what they had shared was special and meaningful. The night was filled with reflection. Tay thought about the journey that had brought them here, the hardships, the unexpected companionship, and the storm that had forced them together. He realized that life often brought people into our paths in ways we could not predict, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections arose in the most unexpected circumstances. Mara, too, reflected on how much Tay and Jeline had changed her perception of the world, showing her kindness, trust, and the possibility of something more than mere survival. When morning arrived, the journey ahead was clear. The desert lay before them, roads rough but passable, and the promise of work and responsibilities waiting in the town beyond. They moved carefully, navigating rocky paths, crossing shallow streams, and keeping a watchful eye on the terrain. The journey tested their endurance and resilience, reminding them that life was full of challenges, but also that those challenges could be faced with courage and companionship. During these long hours of travel, Tay and Mara found themselves relying on each other more and more. When Mara's foot slipped on a wet rock, Tay instinctively reached out to steady her. When Tay struggled to carry a heavy bundle, Mara offered her strength and encouragement. Each act, small as it might seem, reinforced the connection between them, building trust and reliance that would carry forward long after the journey ended. Jeline remained their steady guide, leading the way with quiet competence. He helped them navigate tricky paths, managed supplies, and offered words of advice when necessary. Yet he also knew when to step back, allowing Tay and Mara to face moments together, to strengthen their bond without interference. His presence, calm and reliable, provided a foundation on which their connection could grow securely. As the journey continued, challenges arose, slippery paths, unexpected weather, and moments of fatigue that tested their patience and determination. Yet through each obstacle, the bond between Tay and Mara strengthened. They laughed when things went wrong, supported each other when things were hard, and found small joys in the simple beauty of the desert. The way the sunlight hit the rocks, the gentle murmur of the stream, the songs of birds returning to their nests. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the desert cooled, they stopped to rest. Mara sat beside Tay, leaning slightly against his shoulder, and for the first time, Tay felt a sense of certainty in what he wanted. He wanted to be with her, not just in this moment of shared hardship but in life beyond it. Mara, sensing his unspoken feelings, smiled softly, her hand brushing his. It was a small gesture, but it carried everything that words could not: a promise, a trust, and the beginnings of love that had grown quietly, naturally, and powerfully. The final stretch to town was challenging, but they faced it together. Each step reinforced their reliance on one another, and by the time the town appeared on the horizon, both Tay and Mara understood that the storm had been more than a test of endurance. It had been the catalyst that brought them together. They had discovered strength, courage, and companionship in the most unexpected way, and the connection they shared would guide them forward into a future neither had imagined but both welcomed fully. By the time Tay, Mara, and Jeline reached the edge of the town, the desert behind them felt like a memory, fierce and beautiful, challenging and transformative. The streets were dusty, lined with small shops and simple homes, and people moved about with the steady rhythm of daily life. For Tay and Mara, the world outside the desert cabin was both familiar and strange. Familiar because it was the place where responsibilities and routines awaited them. Strange because the intimacy and connection they had developed during the storm and the desert journey now seemed almost sacred, a private world that belonged only to them. The three walked carefully through the town, navigating crowded streets and observing the people around them. Mara held Tay's arm lightly, a silent reassurance that they would face this new chapter together. Jeline, ever the steady presence, led them to an inn where they could rest, wash, and plan their next steps. The inn was modest but welcoming, with clean beds and a small hearth that gave off warmth. After days of traveling under the sun and through rough terrain, it felt like luxury to them. As they settled in, Tay found himself reflecting on how far they had come. He had entered this journey expecting nothing but survival, yet he had found companionship, trust, and an unexpected sense of belonging. Mara, too, felt the weight of change pressing gently upon her. Life in the town would require adjustment, effort, and courage. But it also promised stability, opportunity, and the continuation of the bond that had formed in the desert. Over the next few days, Tay and Mara began to adjust to the routines of town life, while maintaining the closeness they had developed. Tay found work at a small construction site, his hands skilled and strong, and Mara managed a local bakery, her presence warm and cheerful as she served customers. Though they were busy, their connection never wavered. They found small moments for each other: a shared meal during lunch breaks, a quiet conversation in the early morning before the town fully awoke, and walks along the outskirts of town where the air smelled faintly of the desert they had left behind. Jeline, meanwhile, continued to work nearby, ensuring that the trio had support and stability. Though his role was quieter, he remained an important presence, a reminder of the journey they had undertaken together and the shared experiences that had forged their bond. He occasionally smiled at Tay and Mara, seeing the way their relationship had deepened, but he never interfered, understanding that the connection had to grow naturally, nurtured by trust and mutual respect. One evening, after a long day of work, Tay and Mara walked along a quiet street, the sun casting long shadows across the buildings. Mara stopped suddenly and looked at Tay, her expression serious yet gentle. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about everything that's happened. The storm, the desert, the cabin. It all feels like it was meant to happen, even if it was difficult. Meeting you, it's changed everything for me." Tay's heart swelled at her words. He reached for her hand, holding it gently in his own. "I feel the same way," he replied. "I never expected to find someone like you. I didn't even know I needed someone until I met you. You've made me see life differently, more fully, more deeply, more connected." Her eyes glistened in the fading light. Mara leaned closer, resting her head briefly on his shoulder. It was a small, quiet moment, yet it carried the weight of all they had shared: the storms, the journey, the laughter, the hardships, and the deep understanding that had grown between them. In that instant, the world felt right, balanced, and filled with possibility. As weeks passed, their lives began to settle into a rhythm. The hardships of survival in the desert had been replaced by the steady challenges of everyday life: work, errands, small conflicts, and the occasional unexpected difficulty. Yet through it all, Tay and Mara supported each other. They shared responsibilities, encouraged each other's ambitions, and continued to nurture the quiet intimacy that had blossomed in the desert. Their bond became stronger not through dramatic gestures, but through consistency, reliability, and the small acts of care that spoke louder than words. Tay noticed how much Mara had become a part of his life in ways he hadn't expected. Her laughter brightened even the dullest moments, her advice guided him through difficult decisions, and her presence provided a sense of calm and assurance he had never experienced before. He, in turn, found himself protective, attentive, and deeply committed to her happiness. The connection they shared had moved beyond friendship or companionship. It had become a partnership, rooted in trust, respect, and affection. One afternoon, Mara suggested they take a short trip to the outskirts of the town, to a small hill where they could watch the sunset and feel the desert breeze again. Tay agreed eagerly, knowing how much she loved these small connections to the landscape they had shared. As they walked together, side by side, the familiar scents and sights brought back memories of the storm, the cabin, and the long journey across the desert. Each memory strengthened their bond, reminding them of the challenges they had overcome and the connection that had emerged from those challenges. Reaching the hill, they sat together, watching as the sky transformed into brilliant shades of orange, pink, and purple. The desert in the distance stretched endlessly, a reminder of the journey that had brought them here. Tay turned to Mara, feeling a surge of emotion he could no longer contain. "I want to face everything with you," he said softly. "Not just the easy moments, but the hard ones too. You've become a part of my life in a way I never thought possible. I can't imagine being without you." Mara's eyes filled with tears, but her smile remained gentle and full of warmth. "I feel the same," she whispered. "I didn't know I could feel this way, but I do. You've shown me trust, care, and something I never thought I'd find, a sense of home in another person." That evening marked a turning point in their relationship. What had begun as a chance meeting during a storm had grown into something meaningful, lasting, and real. They returned to town with a new sense of purpose, a shared understanding that they would face life together, and the quiet certainty that they had found something rare and invaluable in each other. Life, of course, continued with its usual mix of challenges and joys. Tay and Mara faced long workdays, occasional disagreements, and the pressures of maintaining responsibilities. Yet through every difficulty, their bond provided strength. They celebrated small victories together, a successful project at work, a delicious meal Mara had baked, or a quiet evening watching the stars. Each moment reinforced their connection and deepened their understanding of each other. Jeline remained a supportive presence throughout, a reminder of the journey that had brought them together and the friendship that had endured beyond survival. He occasionally teased them lightly, seeing how their connection had grown, but he always did so with affection and care. His steady presence allowed Tay and Mara to explore their feelings fully, knowing they had a trusted friend beside them. Months passed and the small town became home. Tay and Mara settled into routines, their lives intertwined in ways both practical and emotional. They worked together, laughed together, and faced the world side by side. Each day brought new experiences, new challenges, and new opportunities to strengthen the bond that had begun in the desert. Their connection, once born of chance, had become intentional, nurtured, and resilient. One quiet evening, as they sat outside their small home watching the sun dip below the horizon, Tay took Mara's hand in his. "I want you to know," he said softly, "that meeting you has changed my life. You are more than someone I needed. You are someone I choose every day to share my life with, and I hope we can face everything together, from the simplest moments to the hardest challenges." Mara's eyes shone in the twilight. "I choose the same," she replied. "You've shown me that life can be more than survival. It can be love, trust, and partnership. I didn't expect to find this, but now that I have, I never want to let it go." As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Tay and Mara sat together in silence, holding hands, feeling the weight and beauty of what they had found. The desert, the storm, the cabin, they were all memories now, reminders of the journey that had led them here. What remained was the life they had built together, the bond that had grown from shared experiences, and the quiet certainty that sometimes the most meaningful connections arise in the most unexpected circumstances. For Tay, the journey had been one of discovery, of survival, of friendship, and ultimately of love. For Mara, it had been a journey of trust, hope, and finding someone who understood her in ways no one else had. Together, they had navigated the unpredictable path of life, finding in each other a sense of home, belonging, and unwavering support. The story did not end with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It ended with quiet affirmation, with daily routines infused with care, laughter, and understanding. Tay and Mara had found in each other a connection that was real, lasting, and profoundly meaningful, a reminder that sometimes the people we are meant to meet appear in our lives when we least expect it, and in their presence, we find a sense of home we never knew we were searching for. The journey had begun with a storm, a small cabin, and the simple need for shelter. It ended with love, trust, and the realization that life's most valuable gifts often arrive in the most unexpected ways. Tay had found Mara, and Mara had found Tay, not because they were looking for each other, but because life, in its unpredictable wisdom, had guided them together. And in that connection, they had discovered a future worth embracing, a life worth sharing, and the deep, quiet joy of having found the person they never knew they needed.